you're going to work at the Ford Motor Company at Highland Park on these new assembly line principles, it's very efficient. That is the way to produce the universal car of Ford's dreams. But it's also work that's mind-numbingly, stultifyingly dull. And hardly anybody liked it. You're standing at one place, limited amount of movements, doing one thing. No wonder people found themselves being very bored at work like this. And in addition, it was also very loud. One commentator compared the roaring, constant noise at Highland Park to a million groaning sinners being dragged to hell. Not an ideal place to work. No wonder the turnover at Highland Park was extraordinarily high. In order to produce the Model T with those 10,000 parts, Ford needed usually about 14,000 workers at the expanding Highland Park plant in the second decade of the 20th century. But to hire and maintain a workforce of 14,000 people, he had to hire 52,000 because that's what the turnover was like. The turnover was an amazing 370% at Highland Park. And what that meant was you're wasting a lot of time training new people to do the thing that they were supposed to do. And in addition, and maybe more seriously, the more people quit, the more they walked off the job, the more the assembly line would stop. And stopping the assembly line means less efficiency. And that means you're not producing as many cars as you like. And that means you can't bring the price down to what you like to bring it down to. This was a problem that had to be solved. There was no doubt about it. And what happened was Ford's last, maybe unless you count the V8 engine, which happened in the 1930s, this might have been Ford's last and potentially greatest work of genius, his greatest innovation of all. How to make sure that workers stayed on the assembly line, how to make sure they didn't quit. They're making about like $220 a day or something. They can make that somewhere else. Why wouldn't they go somewhere else? Ford decided one day in January of 1914, after a meeting with some of his officers, that the wages just had to go up. And it may well have been Ford himself who suggested the sum of $5 a day. And in January 1914, they decided to put that policy into practice. Henceforth, workers at the Ford Motor Company would be paid $5 a day. And that was extraordinary. It made headlines all across the country. Nobody in manufacturing had ever done that. $5 a day for a factory job. It didn't just make headlines, it captured imaginations around the country. And here's what Highland Park looked like. You see all those windows, 75% of this factory was windows. They called it the Crystal Palace. But you can see all these people applying for jobs at the Ford Motor Company. Why not? $5 a day, more than anybody had ever paid for a job like this. And that was the missing piece of the puzzle. You could put up with the drudgery, you could put up with the boredom if you were making $5 a day. And that stable workforce would allow the Model T dependably and quickly to come off the assembly line so that the price could come down ultimately to a little below $300, something the average person might be able to afford. Now, that isn't the whole story. The fact is that you weren't technically paid $5 a day. You were paid about half that in salary and half that as a bonus. And to have the bonus, at least at first, not eventually, but at least at first, you had to agree as a worker to stay sober. You had to stay out of trouble. And that meant that now and then you have to put up with visits at your home by employees of the Ford Motor Company, the sociological department of Ford's company. And many workers didn't like that. This was an intrusion on their private lives, but they were willing to put up with it because it's $5 a day. And if you were an immigrant and you couldn't speak English very well, you had to agree to learn English better. That would make you, Ford believed, not just a better worker, but a better American. At least in his worldview, one of Ford's purposes in the $5 a day wage and bonus was to help immigrants become Americanized. And this is one way to do it, teach them English. And if they weren't going to learn English, they probably weren't going to hold that job and they weren't going to get $5 a day. There was something paternalistic about this, but it was something many workers, in fact, most of them were willing to put up with because of the princely sum to many people of that wage.